My name is Nora Bell. I'm 34 years old. And this past April, my mother called me for the first time in 15 years, not to apologise, but to inform me that she and my father deserved 30% of the 14 restaurants I'd built after they threw me out at 19. The same father who once stood on our porch, arms crossed, and laughed as he told me I'd be begging on the street. For 15 years I believed that porch was the worst thing my family ever did to me. I was wrong. Their lawsuit landed on my desk in May, and buried inside a 16-year-old courthouse file was something far darker than anything they'd done to me at 19. And the package I mailed my mother when it was finally over, she never saw coming. Before we get into it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe if stories about standing your ground keep you company on quiet evenings. This story starts with 2 duffel bags on a porch in June and ends with an envelope my mother will never forget. I grew up in a house where love had a bookkeeping system. Grocery receipts taped to the refrigerator, split 3 ways in blue ink, my share always circled. My mother Diane worked part-time as a bookkeeper and brought the ledgers home in more ways than one. My father Harold ran a struggling farm equipment parts store, and by middle school the house could feel the losses. "Nobody eats for free in this house," he'd say at dinner, and my mother would nod like scripture. At 14, new running shoes for track appeared in the kitchen notebook as advance against future contribution. I worked dish shifts at 15 and handed half of every paycheck into what they called the family fund. It wasn't just tight money. Plenty of families in town were tight. What made our house different was the accounting. Every kindness arrived with interest, and I learned to read those refrigerator numbers before I learned to ride a bike. 6 blocks away, on a quiet street, there was a yellow kitchen where none of those rules applied, and the woman who ran it was my father's own mother, Eleanor Bell. She'd cooked for 40 years, church suppers, funeral lunches, a lunch counter downtown before it closed, and everything she knew lived in one fat notebook with a soft blue cloth cover, crowded with slanted handwriting. She never measured in front of me. She'd press my hands into dough and say, "There, that's what ready feels like." My mother hated my weekends there, called it that soup kitchen, and said a woman who gave food away for free had no business lecturing anyone about money. Eleanor fed everyone who needed it, farmhands, neighbourhood kids whose father drank, a trucker who once knocked on the wrong door and left with a pie. When I asked her once why she never charged, she dusted the flour from her hands and told me, "We feed people because they're hungry, not because they can pay." I was 12 and thought it was a rule about pie. It took 22 years and a courtroom to understand it was a rule about everything, and that she'd said it to me on purpose, because she saw exactly what kind of house I was growing up in, and had quietly already started getting me out of it. Eleanor's heart began failing when I was 16, and by that fall, I was cooking at her stove after school while she directed from a kitchen chair like a small, flour-dusted general, the best afternoons of my life, and I knew it even then. One evening I came in through the back door and heard my mother's voice from the front room, a rare visit, using her bright, patient bank teller tone. "Mom, it's just paperwork. Sign it and I'll handle everything." My grandmother's answer, thin as tissue but iron underneath. "I already signed everything I mean to sign." I was 17 and assumed it was about insurance. 6 weeks later, days before Christmas, Eleanor wrapped the blue notebook in a dish towel and pressed it into my hands. "This is yours," she said. "Keep it where she can't." She died that February on a morning it snowed. At the funeral lunch, my mother offered, almost casually, to keep the notebook safe at our house. I told her I'd already packed it away somewhere safe, the first lie I ever told her, and far from the last time she'd ask. 16 months later, my father's store was visibly dying, and at 19, working full-time at a highway diner after community college money ran out, I was summoned to a Sunday family meeting, my parents on one side of the kitchen table, me on the other. My father slid across a loan application for $40,000 to refinance the store. His credit was wrecked, my mother's tangled with his, and the bank needed a co-signer with clean credit. Then my mother opened her kitchen notebook and turned it toward me. 19 years itemised. Diapers. Braces, running shoes, room and board. Backdated to my 16th birthday. Total underlined twice at $106,000. "We're not asking you for money," she said in that same teller's voice. We're asking you to stand behind this family the way this family stood behind you." I understood perfectly what co-signing would actually mean. I'd seen the empty parking lot, the bare shelves. If that store failed, and it was already failing, the bank would come for the only person at that table with anything left to take. I said no. My father closed the folder slowly, and I knew exactly what came next. They gave me until Saturday. Paragraph 5I packed 2 duffel bags of clothes, a shoebox of paperbacks, and my grandmother's blue notebook zipped inside my jacket, where my mother couldn't see it while she watched. Arms folded, to make sure I didn't take anything that was, by her ledger, technically hers. "When you're ready to contribute," she said at the door, "you know the number," like I was a customer with an unpaid invoice. My father was the one on the porch, leaning on the railing with something that looked almost like relief under his anger. "You'll be begging on the street," he said and laughed, small, dry, certain. "Give it 6 months. I slept in my old sedan for 11 nights behind a grocery store, washed my hair in a gas station sink, hung my work shirts on the hook above the back seat, and never once missed a shift. On the 12th morning, someone knocked on my window. My Aunt Joanne, my father's younger sister, holding an envelope in a dead woman's handwriting, telling me my grandmother had given it to her back in 2009, with exact instructions. Hold it until I needed it most, and not one day sooner. "I'd say that's now," she said. Inside was a payable on death bank account opened in 2009, balance $26,500, beneficiary, me. Not my father, not my mother. Folded around it in that familiar slanted handwriting, for flour, rent and a start. Not for anyone's debts. I sat in my own section of the diner in my apron and cried for the first time since the porch. My grandmother had been dead 16 months and was still the only person taking care of me. And she'd known somehow, well before anyone opened that loan folder, exactly what was coming. I claimed the account, opened my own at a different bank, rented a room above a hardware store, and started pricing used food trucks, spending 2 years working up the nerve before I finally touched a cent of her money. In 2013, I bought a gutted step van at auction for $11,000, poured in repairs, equipment, permits, painted it butter yellow, and hand-lettered the side myself. Eleanor's table. The menu was 5 recipes rebuilt from that blue notebook, rescaled from a farmhouse stove to a 3-burner line, retimed, costed to the penny, tested on my own paychecks until they came out right every time. My biscuits alone took 40 tries. Opening day, I sold 19 orders and drove home with $61 in a cigar box, laughing on the floor of my rented room until the neighbour banged on his ceiling. I taped my first dollar above the visor next to a card in my own handwriting. We feed people because they're hungry, not because they can pay. It was a good summer, and a good fall. And then the winter nearly finished what my parents had started. By January, fair crowds were gone, office parks emptied early, and my generator died in the coldest week of the year, $600 I didn't have. Doing the arithmetic of quitting, I found a page in the blue notebook where my grandmother had written, in the margin of a pot pie recipe, "For cold days. Feed them first." I made 40 pot pies and gave every single one away, free to night shift workers waiting at a dark bus stop, with a card stapled to each box telling them where the truck parked. My mother would have called it insanity, and for 6 days it looked that way. On the 7th there was a line. Plant workers, their families, a foreman ordering a dozen for his whole crew. Pot Pie Thursday carried the business through that winter, and every winter after. Not as a marketing trick, but as her rule, working exactly as she'd said it would. That March, a retired diner owner named Ray Sorensen, who'd been driving out every Thursday for a month, offered me a seller-financed lease on his old building, terms no bank would ever have given a woman with a food truck, and no name worth anything in that county. I signed with shaking hands in 2015, 22 years old. That first year I worked hours I'm not proud of, missed a best friend's wedding for a walk-in freezer failure, and let a patient man stop calling because love felt like a line item I'd get to later. In 2016, I hired Mara Jensen to run the front of house, the best decision I ever made. And one night, watching me recount an already counted drawer, she said, "You know what's weird? We're not broke. You run this place like you're paying off a debt nobody can see." I laughed it off. It would take 10 more years to understand exactly whose ledger I was still working against. That Christmas, a card arrived at the restaurant in my mother's small, forward-slanted handwriting. No letter, just under the printed greeting, "We hear the restaurant is doing well. It would be nice if you remembered where you came from. Your father's shop closed because you refused to help." 5 years of silence, and that was the flag they planted. I wrote a 6-page reply that night, read it back, heard how much it sounded like an invoice, and burned it. I made a decision that held for a decade. No contact, not out of hate, but out of arithmetic. Every exchange with my mother had a price, and I'd finally stopped being able to afford her. I kept the card, though. I couldn't have told you why. Then. The next decade moved fast. A second location in 2016, 4 by 2018. A pandemic pivot to family meal boxes that somehow grew the business instead of breaking it, 8 locations by 2021, 12 by 2024. And by 2026, 14 Eleanor's tables across the region, over 300 employees, and a suspended meal board at every register. Buy a meal for a stranger. No questions asked, straight from a rule about pie. In 2023, I paid off Ray's building 3 years early and mailed him a photo of the deed with a pot pie. He mailed back a napkin reading, "Proud of you, kid," which I framed. And still, every January a woman with 300 employees ran the company's entire numbers alone, twice at night, like somebody was going to check her math. Then in March, a regional business magazine called Wanting a Profile, 14 restaurants, 1 grandmother's notebook, and I said yes, partly for the hiring push, partly for her. They photographed me at the flagship's pass window holding the open notebook, 1 biscuit-stained page filling half the frame. A local news station picked it up. The story travelled, reached my hometown by dinner time, and my front-of-house manager grinned at me over her phone. "Hope your family doesn't watch television." We laughed. I want that on the record. 2 weeks later, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in 15 years, and none of it would be funny. But before that call came, the notebook had one more thing to tell me. All the filming had worn on its old spine, so I took it to a book conservator named Vivian in the historic district, who called me days later with a strange care in her voice. The back cover was thicker than the front, and stitched flat against the cardboard under the cloth was a manila envelope, soft with age, labelled in my grandmother's hand, "For the day they come for this." Inside was a single page, dated October 2009, the same fall I'd overheard "It's just paperwork" in the hallway, listing exactly where to find her handwriting if anyone ever questioned what belonged to her. Monthly letters to Joanne going back 20 years, a bank signature card, church kitchen sign-in ledgers, and at the bottom, 3 lines I've since memorised like a prayer. Diane asked me twice to sign papers about my recipes. I never signed. If a paper ever says I did, it lies. I drove home with that envelope on the passenger seat like a living thing, put it in the flagship's safe, and told no one. 9 days later, standing in that same kitchen, my phone lit up with a word I'd deleted from my contacts a decade earlier. Mom. She opened with a number instead of a greeting. "We've seen the article. We think 30% is fair." I told her she'd put me on the street with 2 bags. There hadn't been a phone to call. She didn't miss a beat. "We taught you independence. Look what you did with it. And this is how you repay it?" There it was. Repay. 34 years old, 14 restaurants, and my mother could still find the ledger in any sentence. She talked about family, about what people were saying in town, about the retirement the failed store had cost them, and finally landed on the line she'd clearly rehearsed. "Everything you are, you owe to this family." I looked down the length of my own kitchen, my own cooks, my grandmother's biscuits browning in an oven she never lived to see, and said, "No, everything I am, someone in this family gave me free. There's a difference, Mom. You've just never once been on the right side of it." I hung up with steady hands. The following Friday, a process server handed me a lawsuit in front of a full dining room, my parents as plaintiffs, seeking a court declaration that 30% of everything I owned had really been theirs all along, built entirely on a supposedly recently discovered codicil to my grandmother's will, dated November 2009, leaving all recipes and culinary property to my father. That exact same month I'd stood in a hallway hearing, "It's just paperwork," and my grandmother had sewn a map into a book. Cover my hometown paper. Ran it that Sunday. Local restaurant owner sued by her own parents. And the comment section split predictably, half calling my parents disgraceful, half suggesting I'd probably taken what wasn't mine. I hired the best probate litigator in the region, Renata Cole, whose office had no waiting room music, which told me I'd chosen correctly. Before I even reached her conference room, the lawsuit had already started collecting rent on its own. My bank froze construction financing on a 15th location pending litigation. A build-out stalled mid-drywall, and 2 of my best managers quietly updated their resumes. That's the part nobody tells you about a nuisance lawsuit. It doesn't have to win to cost you everything. Renata read the complaint in 10 minutes and called it exactly what it was. Weak law. Recipes aren't property you can copyright, and a 16-year-old codicil surfacing 3 weeks after you're on television is the kind of coincidence judges notice. This is an expensive nuisance. They're betting you'll pay to make it stop. Then she studied the signature on the codicil for a long, quiet moment, turned it 90 degrees back again, and asked me the strangest question of that entire spring. Did your grandmother send Christmas cards? We pulled the original 2010 probate file, which told a simple story. A small, clean estate. A plain 2-page will properly witnessed. No mention anywhere of a codicil or recipes. To reopen a 16-year-old closed estate, my parents' lawyer had filed a motion claiming the codicil was only just found in an attic box the previous fall. Rare, but courts allow it, Renata said. The judge will want to know exactly where it's been. So do I. I put my grandmother's sewn-in envelope on her desk, the letter, the list, the 3 final lines. Renata, who bills in 6-minute increments and has never once raised her voice in my presence, read it twice, and when she reached "if a paper ever says I did," "It lies," set it down with 2 fingers like it was evidence and porcelain at once. "Ms. Bell," she said, "your grandmother is about to testify." Then she started a list. Every letter, every ledger, every signature Eleanor Bell had left behind. We gathered her piece by piece. Joanne met us with a fireproof box, holding hundreds of letters spanning decades, dated, signed, postmarked. The church kitchen still had its sign-in ledgers. The bank produced her 2008 signature card under subpoena. By the end of the week, Renata's team had built a 20-year handwriting timeline, and I'd spent 3 evenings reading a dead woman's mail with my aunt, laughing and wrecked by turns. On the last of those evenings, Joanne told me something I hadn't wanted to hear, that when my mother was 9, a sheriff had set her family's furniture out on the lawn for everyone to see, and she'd stood on the sidewalk in her school clothes guarding a lamp. She grew up believing the only things that can't be taken from you are the things with your name on paper, Joanne said. Eleanor saw that hunger in her from the very first week your father brought her home. That's why she never let Diane near her papers, not out of spite. She just knew what that kind of hunger looks like grown up. Something in my chest moved about an inch. Understanding, I reminded myself, was not the same thing as forgiveness. A forensic document examiner named Dr. Priya Anand, 19 years of telling courts where the paper was lying, took the codicil and the collected samples for 3 weeks, then showed us the result on a monitor. The signature on the codicil was a point-for-point match, line weight, letter spacing, an identical break in one letter, to a specific known signature on a 2003 Christmas card my grandmother had mailed to Joanne. No 2 genuine signatures are ever identical, she explained. Not from the same hand, not on the same day. That match doesn't happen in nature. It happens on a light table with patience. Under magnification, she showed us hesitation marks where a pen had crawled instead of flowed, and the faint fossil of a pencil tracing beneath the ink. One of the codicil's 2 supposed witnesses had, county records showed, died 2 years before the date he'd allegedly watched my grandmother sign. My mother hadn't found my grandmother's signature. She'd farmed it, grown a dead woman's hand in a garden of old holiday mail that had sat in a photo album in my parents' own living room for 20 years. Renata delivered the complication that turned everything. My father intended to testify the codicil was genuine, which meant we needed to find out, first, what he actually knew. We deposed my father on a Tuesday in Renata's conference room, and he looked smaller across that table than the man on the porch 15 years earlier. Hands like old rope, most of his hair gone grey. He wouldn't look at me. His story was smooth because he believed every word. His wife found a box in the attic, brought him the codicil, and he'd recognised his mother's signature the way you recognise a voice on the phone. When he said that, something crossed his face I hadn't expected. Pride, even relief. 65 years old, and here at last was a piece of paper saying his mother, who'd cooked for the whole county, but somehow never showed up for his ambitions, who'd skipped his store's opening for a church funeral lunch, who'd left her only real treasure to his teenage daughter, had chosen him after all. He didn't just believe the codicil was real. He needed it to be. I understood then, with a coldness that had nothing to do with anger, exactly what I was holding. The truth wouldn't just win my case. It would sit down at that man's kitchen table and take both his wife and his mother from him in the same afternoon. And I would be the one delivering it. That night, an email arrived from my parents' lawyer, a settlement offer, almost gently worded, dismissing the entire lawsuit in exchange for $200,000, framed as a goodwill resolution honouring the family legacy, with a mutual confidentiality clause and a closing line. Your parents are old. This is your chance to make things right. Even the offer of mercy came with an invoice attached. My front-of-house manager, reading it in my office, said what any practical friend would. Pay it. It's cheaper than a year of litigation. Renata laid out the business logic evenly and let the rest be mine to weigh. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 a.m, and I very nearly paid. For peace, for an open bank line, for the faint old hope that my mother might finally say something kind about what I'd built. All I had to do was cover one bill I didn't owe and keep one small secret about one forged signature forever. Then I read my grandmother's 3 lines again. She hadn't asked me to win. She'd asked me not to let the lie stand. In the morning I called Renata and told her, simply, file the report. I knew exactly what I was releasing when I gave that instruction, that the report could never be unsealed from the world once it entered it, that my father would eventually read it or hear it, that whatever remained of my parents' 42-year marriage was standing in the road and I had just released the truck. I won't pretend it was only litigation strategy. That would be hiding. I had a door marked $200,000 in silence, and I closed it myself on purpose. I texted Joanne one line, be near your brother next week. He's going to need somebody who isn't Diane, and went back to work. Because Bread doesn't care about your subpoenas. My mother's deposition landed on a Tuesday morning. She walked in with fresh lipstick, and the confident smile of a woman who still believed she held the ledger, answering Renata's soft, patient questions in her old bright teller's voice. The attic. Last October, she and Harold present, and a small, wounded pause when asked if she'd ever discussed the recipes with Eleanor before her death. We weren't close. She wasn't an easy woman, but she knew what family means. She knew the recipes belonged with the family. Then Renata produced the 2003 Christmas card, asked her to confirm the signature was Eleanor's, which she did, and laid the transparency of the codicil's signature directly over it. Under the fluorescent light, the 2 names 6 years apart nested into each other like a single ghost. My mother didn't look at the overlay. She looked straight down the table at me, and what filled her face wasn't guilt or fear. It was fury, the bewildered fury of a bookkeeper whose numbers had finally stopped obeying her. Her lawyer called for a recess in a voice gone grey. In the confusion, my father reached across the abandoned table, picked up the overlay with both hands, and held it to the light for a long time, before turning to my mother and asking, very quietly, Diane, where did you get my mother's Christmas card? No one answered him. Their lawyer approached us within the hour, immediate dismissal with prejudice, every legal fee covered, in exchange for the expert report withdrawn and sealed, mutual confidentiality, nothing outside that room would ever need to be known. It was everything I'd wanted since a process server interrupted my lunch rush, the case dead, the bank unfrozen, my parents' marriage left intact, my father left with his merciful lie, the town left with a boring story about a misunderstanding settled quietly. All I had to do was help bury my grandmother's signature a second time. Through the glass wall, I could see my father alone at the long table, the overlay still in his hands, reading it over and over like a man trying to translate his own life. 65 years old, hungry his whole life for one sentence from his mother, holding proof that the only version of it he'd ever gotten was counterfeit. I heard her voice then, clear as any Saturday morning. We feed people because they're hungry. The truth was the only thing left to set in front of him, and it was going to taste like ash, and it was still food. I turned back to Renata and said, in my calmest kitchen voice, "No seal, no confidentiality. The report stays fully in the record, dismissal with prejudice, they pay your fees, and no criminal referral." I wasn't sending my mother to be prosecuted. Somebody in this family had to be the first one to stop collecting, and it was going to be me. They took the deal because there was nothing left to take. But before the papers were even drawn, my father walked back into that room unasked, picked up a pen, and withdrew as a plaintiff on his own separate line, his hand shaking so badly the court reporter looked away to give him privacy. My mother hissed his name once, like a command he'd always obeyed. He didn't look at her. On his way out, he stopped in front of me, smelling faintly of machine oil like his old store, and said, gravel-voiced, "I said you'd beg." "I know," I said. He made himself look at me, and I watched what it cost him. "You never did." No apology. Men like him weren't built for one. But it was the first time in my life he'd looked at me like a person instead of a balance. Then he walked past his wife of 42 years without turning his head, and Joanne was waiting in the lobby exactly where I'd asked her to be. The court dismissed the case with prejudice that August and ordered my parents to cover my legal fees. The local paper ran the forensic report on its front page. 3 weeks later, my phone rang before the morning shift. Same number as April, same voice, same arithmetic. "Your father moved out. He's at Joanne's. He filed papers last week. 42 years, Nora, and he filed papers." When I said nothing, she found her old rail like a stream finding a ditch. "I hope you're satisfied. This lawsuit destroyed our family. And you have 14 restaurants and we have nothing. The least you can do is acknowledge we still deserve something. 30% of nothing is nothing. Be reasonable." Her husband gone, her name in the paper beside the word forged, and my mother was still somehow billing me. What I felt wasn't anger. It was finished, the specific bone-deep quiet of a long shift ending, the last burner clicking off. Everything I'd ever needed to say to her was already in a court file, except for one thing, already in the mail. "Check your mailbox," I said, and hung up. Inside a plain envelope waiting at that house were 3 things. A complete copy of the forensic report, because the truth was the one debt I genuinely owed her. A photocopy of my grandmother's sewn-in letter, so she'd finally know the woman she'd traced off a Christmas card had seen her coming 16 years in advance, and answered her patiently, from the grave. And on top, a single recipe card in my own handwriting, chicken pot pie, complete, nothing held back, crust, timing, margin note and all, because once, back when I was small, my mother had eaten that pie at my grandmother's table and said, with no invoice attached, "That's wonderful," the only free thing I ever heard her give Eleanor Bell. Underneath, I wrote what I'd finally understood. No invoice. It was never for sale. It was always free. And that was the part she'd never understood. My mother has never called again. Joanne told me later that when she stopped by that house that fall, the refrigerator door was bare. No receipts. No blue ink. Except one thing pinned dead centre with a magnet. A recipe card for chicken pot pie. My father lives in Joanne's spare room now, and once a month he drives to the flagship, sits at the counter like any other customer, and orders the pot pie. He pays every time. I've told him it's free. He leaves the money under the plate anyway, and I've stopped fighting it because I finally understand it's the only language he has left, and he's using it to say something he still can't say out loud. We start with silence and work up from there, and some months that's its own kind of peace.